They say beauty fades. But for Hypatia, it was knowledge that condemned her. When the torches of the mob lit the marble streets of Alexandria, her name was already whispered in fear. The woman who defied priests, rulers, and men alike. A philosopher, whose words carried more weight than a bishop's sermon, whose eyes saw truth where others saw heresy. And for that, she was hunted. They dragged her through the very streets that once echoed her lectures, her blood staining the stones of Anasaeti, empire already dying. But the story you're about to hear is not merely of one woman's death. It's about how a world silenced its brightest voice, and how love, power, and faith collided in a city that burned both books and souls. Before we begin, if you believe, stories like these, of forgotten brilliance and unbearable tragedy, deserve to be told, take a moment to subscribe, to keep these lost voices alive. Because history remembers conquerors, but we must remember the silenced. The city smelled of salt and smoke. Alexandria, once the jewel of the ancient world, stretched along the glittering curve of the Mediterranean like a promise of immortality. Ships from every corner of the empire drifted into its harbors, their sails painted with the colors of 1,000 nations. Greek philosophers, Roman merchants, Egyptian priests, and wandering Jews filled its streets, their languages clashing and merging like the sea against stone. Above them all rose the great library, or what remained of it, and the dream it represented, that knowledge could be eternal. It was here, amid scrolls that held the secrets of the stars, that Hypatia was born. Her father, Theon, was a mathematician, an astronomer, a man who believed that the universe could be measured and understood through the purity of numbers. He taught his daughter not as a child to be married off, but as a mind to be sharpened, while other girls were taught to embroider, silk. Hypatia traced the paths of planets on wax tablets, her fingers smudged with ink and dust. They say that even as a child she could silence a room without raising her voice. There was something in her eyes, a clarity, a stillness, that made men twice her age falter. Knowledge, she once told a student, is not the opposite of faith. It is faith, refined. By the time she reached her 30s, Hypatia was already legend. The halls of the Serapeum echoed with her lectures, elegant, precise, and fearless. She spoke not only of mathematics and philosophy, but of the harmony between thought and nature. Her students called her the philosopher of Alexandria. Some even whispered the last of the Greeks. But outside those marble halls, the city was changing. The old gods, Serapis, Isis, Athena, were being driven out, their temples stripped, their statues toppled and buried. Christianity, once a persecuted faith, now ruled under imperial favor. Bishops held more power than generals. Sermons carried more fear than swords. And in that trembling balance between the dying world of the ancients and the newborn empire of Christ, a woman teaching men became a dangerous sight. The first stones were not thrown at her, but at her ideas. Bishop Cyril of Alexandria, a man as brilliant as he was ruthless, saw in Hypatia the embodiment of pagan arrogance, a woman who dared to lead, to question, to think without the sanction of God. In the flicker of candlelight, his followers called her a witch, a heretic, the enchantress who bewitched men away from faith. And so, rumor became gospel. Still, Hypatia refused to hide. Every morning she walked through the marketplace with her scrolls pressed to her chest, her white robes trailing through the dust. The sun would catch her face as she passed the great Caesareum, and merchants would fall silent, not out of reverence, but confusion. For in a world where women were veiled, Hypatia was unveiled, proud, and unashamed. At night, the city hummed, with tension. Fires burned on the horizon where temples once stood. The shouts of zealots echoed down alleyways, mingled with the prayers of frightened scholars. And yet, Inside her small chamber lined with maps of the stars, Hypatia continued her work. The soft scratch of her stylus was the sound of defiance. Sometimes, her father would visit her in those quiet hours. "The world grows darker," he would say, his hands trembling with age. "Even the brightest flame cannot last forever." She would smile faintly and point toward the heavens. "Then let us learn how the stars endure." But Alexandria was not a city that tolerated light for long. It devoured its visionaries, its poets, its thinkers. And soon, it would devour her too. For every empire that burns its heretics believes it is purifying itself. And every time it does, it loses something divine. On one windless night, a young messenger brought news to Hypatia's door. The governor, Orestes, wished to see her. The city's politics had reached a breaking point, and only her council, he said, could steady the storm. She hesitated, for Orestes was not merely a friend, but a man whose gaze lingered too long when she spoke of reason and justice. She closed her scrolls, extinguished her lamp, and stepped into the silence of the streets. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang, not in celebration, but in warning. And so began the chain of events that would lead to the most infamous murder in the ancient world. The first time Orestes met Hypatia, he thought he had encountered a goddess. She was standing beneath the colonnade of the Serapeum, sunlight pouring through the marble columns, her white robes outlined in gold. Around her, students sat in a semicircle, silent except for the occasional scratching of a stylus. She did not look up when Orestes approached, only spoke, her voice calm, melodic, unhurried. "The mind," she said, "is a chariot. Reason holds the reins, but passion pulls the horses. When one overpowers the other, the soul is torn apart." Orestes had come expecting a scholar. He found something far more dangerous: conviction. He was newly appointed governor of Egypt, a Roman in title, but Alexandrian by heart. His task was impossible: to govern a city divided between pagans and Christians, scholars and zealots, each convinced the other was damned. Hypatia, though she claimed no power, commanded more loyalty than any priest or soldier. Her students were senators, merchants, even bishops' sons. Her word, whispered in the agora, could tilt the city's balance. They became allies first. He would visit her after dusk, when the sea wind swept dust through the streets and the harbor fires burned like distant stars. She would pour him wine, sweetened with honey, and they would speak of Plato, of virtue, of the perfect harmony between body and soul. But beneath their words lingered something unsaid, a gravity that neither dared name. To love Hypatia was to love a flame that could never be possessed. She lived for ideas, not for desire. When Orestes' hand once brushed hers, she pulled away gently, as though touched by pity more than alarm. "The philosopher must be married to truth," she told him softly. "To love me would be to love what cannot be held." Yet Orestes could not let go. In her presence he saw the Alexandria that might have been, a city ruled by thought instead of fear. He wanted to protect her, but in doing so, he made her a symbol. The tension between church and state was already boiling. Bishop Cyril's sermons grew more venomous with each passing week. He called Orestes a heathen puppet and Hypatia his pagan mistress. To the crowds, that lie was easier to believe than the truth, that a woman could be wise without sin. The city began to split in two. In the mornings, mobs of monks from Nitria stormed the streets, their chants rising like a war cry. They attacked Jews, pagans, anyone who resisted the bishop's will. Orestes responded with Roman iron, soldiers in bronze helmets, shields glinting red beneath the sun. But every act of control birthed more chaos. Hypatia watched it unfold from her balcony overlooking the Canopic Way. She saw how faith, once pure, became a weapon. "They destroy temples," she murmured to one of her students. "But the ruins they build are inside themselves." The rumors spread faster than fire. "She bewitches him," they whispered. "She reads the stars to control the governor's mind." One morning, a note was nailed to her door, a crude drawing of a serpent coiled around a cross. Beneath, it the words, "The witch shall burn." Still, she lectured. Still, she walked the streets unveiled. To retreat would be to surrender reason itself. When Orestes begged her to leave the city, to sail north until the storm passed, she shook her head. "If I run," she said, "they will say I was guilty, and truth will lose its last defender." Her resolve broke something in him. That night, he came to her home under the cover of darkness, his cloak drawn tight, his eyes fevered with desperation. "They will kill you," he said. "Then they will prove me right," she replied. For a long moment, silence. The world beyond the window was quiet, only the far-off hum of the sea. Then he reached for her, not as a ruler but as a man. "If you have ever loved anything in this life," he whispered, "let it not be your death." Her gaze softened, and for the first time her voice trembled. "I have loved," she said, "but not as others do." She took a small linen cloth, stained with the dust of her scrolls, and handed it to him. "Keep this," she told him, "so you will remember that there was once light in this city." When Orestes left her house that night, he knew it was the last time he would see her alive. The next morning, the monks marched again, this time not against Jews, not against pagans, but toward her home. The crowds followed, chanting her name, twisting it into a curse. And in the heart of Alexandria, between marble and blood, the age of reason began to die. The city woke to smoke. It began in the slums near the harbor, a thin gray thread rising against the dawn, but by midday, flames licked the sky like tongues of judgment. Alexandria was burning again. The wind carried the smell of cedar, oil and flesh, and through the haze, church bells tolled not for prayer, but for power. The fire, they said, was punishment, divine wrath for unbelievers, pagans, and those who dared to speak against the bishop. The people whispered that God himself had turned his face toward the city, that the smoke was his breath. But in truth, it was men, not heaven, who kindled that blaze. Cyril's followers, robed in black and wielding iron crosses, swept through the streets like locusts. They dragged scholars from their homes, burned scrolls and statues, and tore down the last remnants of the old temples. To them, purity meant silence, and Hypatia was the loudest voice left. From her window, she saw it all. The shouts, the flames, the screams of those who once sat in her lectures. She did not cry. She only stood still, her face pale against the orange glow, her hands trembling around a rolled parchment. Her father's last work, on the movements of the stars. When one of her students burst through the door, blood on his tunic, she turned slowly to face him. "They're saying you are the cause," he gasped, "that you've bewitched Orestes, that your numbers and charts are spells to curse the faithful." She looked past him, toward the burning skyline. "When ignorance calls itself holy," she said softly, "reason becomes the devil." That night, the mob found Orestes' carriage outside the governor's palace. Stones shattered its windows. A spear lodged into its wheel. He barely escaped alive. In the chaos, one of his attendants was captured, tortured until he confessed, to crimes imagined by zealots. They demanded Orestes renounce Hypatia, to call her what they called her, witch, heretic, temptress. He refused. And in doing so, sealed both their fates. The next morning, the city's air felt heavier. The harbor was lined with ships waiting for wind that would not come, as if even the sea itself held its breath. Rumors crawled like insects through the marketplace that the bishop's men were hunting her, that they had been blessed with holy oil for her capture. Some said they carried ropes, others said knives. Still others claimed they needed nothing but their faith. Hypatia's students begged her to flee. Some offered to hide her in the catacombs beneath the old library, others to bribe passage on a ship bound for Athens. She thanked them, but refused. "I will not leave," she said. "I will not let terror be our teacher." She walked the streets one last time, her steps echoing against the cracked stones of the Canopic Way. The people she passed turned away, afraid even to meet her gaze. Once they had greeted her with flowers. Now they whispered prayers against her shadow. A child threw a pebble at her feet. His mother pulled him back, muttering an apology through her fear. At the steps of the Caesareum, the grand temple now, claimed by the church, she paused. The doors were closed, but the chants inside were unmistakable. Deus vult. God wills it. She remembered her father's voice, teaching her that the heavens moved in harmony, that every planet obeyed a pattern of divine geometry. Looking now at the city that had forgotten its reason, she wondered if human hearts followed the same design, or if they spun, mad and unbound, until destruction was inevitable. That evening, she wrote her final lecture. There were no students. To hear it, only the wind and the flicker of a single lamp. "Truth," she wrote, "is eternal, but men fear its shadow. They will kill me, but they will not kill what I am." Outside, the mob gathered, monks with shaven heads, fishermen with clubs, merchants who once bowed before her. They carried torches and psalms, their faces lit with righteous fury. Somewhere among them, an order was given, a nod exchanged, a prayer whispered. And as the last flame of knowledge trembled in that ancient house, the footsteps began to climb the stairs. The morning was unnaturally still, as if the city itself were waiting. The sea lay flat against the shore, reflecting the gray of the clouds. In the narrow streets, dogs barked without cause. Somewhere, a priest was preaching of sin and redemption, his voice rising like smoke through the alleys. Hypatia stepped from her home, wrapped in her scholar's cloak. She carried no books that day, no scrolls, no symbols of the wisdom that had once defined her. Only a small pouch of sand, which she often used to blot the ink from her writings. The streets were damp from the night's mist, her sandals leaving faint prints on the stones. She was heading to the Serapeum, or perhaps to Orestes. No one knows for certain. What we do know is that she never arrived. At the corner of the Caesareum, they were waiting. A mob of men, once monks, now murderers, clothed in black, their faces shadowed, their eyes burning with that strange light born of conviction. They called her name not with reverence, but as an accusation. Hypatia. She turned, startled but not afraid. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice calm as ever. "Justice," one of them spat. "The justice of God." They surrounded her. The crowd grew quickly. Fishermen, beggars, merchants drawn by the scent of blood. Her chariot driver tried to intervene but was struck down. She raised her hands, not in surrender, but as if to quiet the madness. "My friends," she began, her tone gentle, almost pleading. "You are deceived. I am no enemy of God. I seek only—" The first stone struck her shoulder. She staggered but did not cry out. Another followed, sharp, heavy, tearing her robe. The mob surged forward. They dragged her from the chariot, through the dust, through the same streets where she had once been honored. Some said she prayed as they pulled her toward the Caesareum. Others said she was silent, her eyes fixed on something beyond them all, a light no mob could touch. Inside the great hall, the air was cold. The walls still bore the carvings of the old gods, half erased, their faces scarred by hammers and faith. Here, beneath the gaze of mutilated marble, they made her trial. "She has corrupted the governor," one shouted. "She has bewitched." "The people!" cried another. "Kill the witch!" No voice rose in her defense. Even the echoes stayed silent. They stripped her of her robes, not in lust, but in ritual humiliation. To them, she was not a woman now, but a symbol to be broken. They dragged her to the floor and struck her with shards of pottery, the very fragments of knowledge she had once cherished. Flesh and clay, truth and ruin, mingled in that sacred place. The screams that followed were swallowed by the stone. When, at last, she fell still, the leader of the mob, a deacon named Peter, if the chroniclers are to be believed, ordered her body burned. They carried the remains through the streets, a grotesque procession of holy men bearing their triumph. By the time Orestes heard the news, it was too late. He locked himself in the palace, trembling not with fear, but with grief. Those who saw him that night said he knelt before a basin of water, washing his hands over and over, as though he could cleanse the stain from his soul. Outside, the fires burned her memory to ash. But in that destruction, something strange happened. The city grew quiet. Even the zealots, their fury spent, felt the weight of what they had done. The bishop preached that justice had been served, that the witch had been purged, yet his words rang hollow. The people who once shouted her name in hatred now spoke it in whispers of regret. Hypatia was gone, but her death became a question that haunted the empire. How could a faith born in love end in such cruelty? How could men destroy the very wisdom that once defined them? And somewhere, beyond the stars she studied, perhaps she watched, silent, unbroken, her spirit still orbiting. The truth she refused to abandon. The morning after her death, Alexandria was eerily calm. The smoke from her burning body drifted over the harbor, mingling with the mist that rose from the sea. The gulls circled above the waves, crying out like mourners, their white wings catching. The first pale light of dawn. The streets were wet, washed clean by rain, but beneath the surface, the stones still remembered. Blood once spilled, never truly fades. The city moved on, or tried to. The markets reopened. Priests resumed their sermons. Fishermen mended their nets. Yet everywhere lingered the echo of what had been done. People avoided the square before, the Caesareum, where the scent of smoke still clung to the air. The same place where the gods had once been worshipped now reeked of death and sanctimony. Orestes vanished soon after. Some say he fled north to Constantinople, broken by grief and guilt. Others claim he was recalled to Rome, stripped of his title and buried in political obscurity. But the truth, like the love he never confessed aloud, was lost to time. All that remained of him was a scrap of parchment found years later, unsigned but written in his hand. I ruled a city that murdered its soul. Cyril remained bishop. History in its cruelty rewarded him. The church canonized him centuries later, sainting the man whose followers had torn a philosopher apart. It was a reminder of how the victors write the scriptures, and how memory can be more fragile than parchment. But memory, even buried, has a way of breathing again. For decades after, scholars in secret whispered her name. They copied fragments of her writings, hid them in monasteries and foreign libraries. In the quiet glow of lamplight, they studied her equations, her theories, her ideas about the harmony of the cosmos. She became more than a woman. She became a symbol of reason's last breath before the long sleep of the Middle Ages. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell. The Library of Alexandria, already a ghost in her lifetime, became myth. A grave of wisdom lost to flame. Yet her spirit lingered in the minds of those who still believed that truth was worth suffering for. Every philosopher who questioned power, every scientist who defied dogma, every woman who refused to bow, they were, in some unspoken way, her descendants. In time, the church tried to forget her. The records were rewritten, her name omitted. From chronicles, her teachings replaced by silence. But silence has its own resonance. When the Renaissance dawned, she reemerged like light from beneath the ashes. Artists painted her not as a heretic, but as a martyr crowned with stars. Writers called her the last philosopher of the ancient world. Voltaire called her the purest soul of antiquity. And perhaps she was. For what could be purer than the courage to think freely, knowing that thought itself could be fatal? If you walk today through the ruins of Alexandria, the sea still breathes against the shore as it did then. The wind hums through the broken columns, through the bones of temples and homes alike. Somewhere beneath that sand lies the dust of scrolls that once held the sum of human knowledge, and among them, perhaps, the ashes of a woman who refused to kneel. They buried her without ceremony, without grave or stone. But the world built her a monument far grander than marble. Memory. She reminds us still that wisdom has always been fragile, that truth demands its price, and that every age must choose whether to light the torch of knowledge or raise the Eid's sword of faith. And as history turns, her question still hangs over us, like a whisper carried by the wind across the centuries. When the mob comes again, as it always does, will we defend the thinker, or join the crowd that burns her? See answers with silence, the stars with eternity, and Hypatia, the woman who taught men to look upward, remains forever among them.